All right, so we're diving into non-market approaches today, specifically under Article 6.8. There's a whole new frontier in climate action, right? Huge potential, but I'm not gonna lie, it gets pretty complex.
Yeah, it really is a whole new world. I mean, Article 6.8 is all about countries working together on climate goals, but outside that traditional carbon market system. Think more like joint projects, like maybe reforestation,
Oh.
or even just sharing knowledge.
So less about just buying and selling those carbon credits and more about finding solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. It's about tackling those root causes of climate change. But, and you probably already guessed this, that can get, well, really complicated.
Which is where I'm guessing this checklist comes in, the Comprehensive Non-Market Approach Implementation Checklist. Carbon Updates put this together.
You got it. It's like a roadmap. Helps you navigate all the technical, the legal, the stakeholder challenges. Because, actually putting these NMAs into practice, it's tricky.
I bet there are things in this checklist that most people wouldn't even think about. Like, I was reading that a lot of developing economies just aren't ready to deal with some of the key parts of NMAs.
Yeah, it's a real issue for equitable climate action, for sure. The checklist, it says 78% of developing economies, they don't have the capacity for some pretty important stuff,
Yes.
like detailed geospatial analysis, which you need, to track how a project's going, let's say a forest project, or even just the expertise to engage with stakeholders and do it in a way that avoids conflict.
Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this. A country could have a fantastic idea for an NMA, but they get stuck because they just don't have the right people or the right tech.
Exactly. And honestly, that's just one piece of the puzzle. NMAs, they have to line up with national climate pledges, with sustainable development goals, even sometimes cross-border agreements. There's a lot to consider.
No wonder it seems overwhelming. This checklist, it mentions something like 15 different UNFCCC frameworks that need to be factored in. How's anyone supposed to keep track of all that?
It's a lot to juggle, but I mean, it just shows how important it is to be prepared. And that's why this checklist's focus on pre-feasibility assessment is so important.
So before you even start with an NMA, you need to do your homework,
Yeah.
like a deep dive into the politics, the laws, all the potential risks. It's like almost like doing background checks, but for the entire project.
It's a good way to put it. The checklist actually uses this thing called a power interest matrix, maps out all the potential roadblocks you might hit, helps you figure out who those veto players might be. The ones who might try to block the NMA could be for political reasons, maybe economic concerns, or, well, who knows what else.
Okay, so I'm picturing this like a detective's board.
Yeah.
Photos and red string connecting it all. You're trying to figure out who's with you and who's against you on this NMA.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. You need a full legal audit, too. Got to make sure all the existing regulations, they don't clash with how you're setting up your NMA.
Wait, so how many documents are we talking about here?
Yeah. Well, the checklist recommends reviewing over 15 different regulatory documents. Yeah, it's a lot. Things like a country's climate change act, their framework for those public-private partnerships, all that legal stuff. It's got to be solid.
That's a lot to keep track of. I can see how easy it would be to miss something and trip up.
Oh, for sure. It's one of those things where a tiny detail can come back to bite you later. And let's be honest, these legal audits, they can take forever, especially if you're, digging through mountains of paperwork.
Which makes me think, isn't there some way to make that process faster? Can technology help here at all?
You're thinking along the right lines. It's something Carbon Updates is actually working on with their AI tools. They've got these platforms that can analyze tons of legal data, find those potential conflicts, even point out places where the laws, maybe they need updating. All about using tech to make legal audits faster, more accurate, and a lot less scary.
So instead of spending weeks going through every single document, you could have, like, an AI do the grunt work. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it could be a total game changer, especially for organizations that might not have a whole team of lawyers on staff.
Okay, so we've covered the politics, we've talked about the laws.
Yeah.
What's next on this checklist? What other traps do we need to watch out for?
Well, one of the biggest and one people often forget is stakeholder engagement. You absolutely have to get everyone on board right from the beginning. And that means understanding their concerns, knowing what they need, and making sure everyone benefits from the NMA, especially when you're working with groups who haven't always had a seat at the table, or maybe their interests don't perfectly align with the NMA's goals.
That makes sense. But how do you actually do that?
Mm.
Especially with so many different stakeholders, they're all going to have different priorities, right? Some of them might even be, like, completely opposed.
It's definitely tricky. The checklist mentions this interesting thing called Q methodology. It's a way to do research, but it's qualitative, Helps you uncover those hidden values and perspectives that people might not be shouting about.
So it's not about assuming you know what everyone wants, but actually taking the time to figure it out.
Right. It's about making sure everyone feels heard and that their concerns are, being taken seriously. The checklist goes even further, though. It recommends using these conflict prediction algorithms. They're actually pretty accurate.
Hold on, conflict prediction algorithms? That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Uh-huh, maybe, but it's more common than you think. They use data, and machine learning to spot those potential flashpoints where conflict could erupt. They can analyze things like historical land use, demographics, even what people are saying on social media, get a sense of way those tensions are bubbling under the surface.
Wow, so it's like an early warning system for conflict.
Exactly. Helps you avoid major problems down the line. And it's another great example of how technology can make implementing these NMAs smoother and, well, more effective. Of course, tech is just one part of the puzzle. You still need people who are good at facilitating and a real commitment to having open conversations to actually address those concerns.
It's like the technology is a tool, right? It's not replacing the human side of things, but it helps us connect and find that common ground. Speaking of technology, I'm curious about how it fits into another big piece of NMAs: monitoring, reporting, and verification, or as most people call it, MRV.
Ah, yeah. MRV. That's essential. Got to make sure the NMA is actually delivering, right? Both in terms of cutting emissions and all those social and economic benefits. And technology, well, it's a game changer for MRV.
In what way? What kind of tech are we talking about?
Well, the checklist outlines a whole range of approaches for monitoring. You've got everything from using those basic IPCC default factors to these super sophisticated systems. They use remote sensing data from satellites, combine it with measurements taken on the ground. And technology, it's what makes those sophisticated approaches possible. Satellites can track deforestation, drones can monitor those reforestation efforts, sensors can measure changes in soil carbon. It's pretty amazing what we can do now.
So we're using tech to create this like super detailed picture of what's happening and making sure the NMA is actually working as intended.
That's the idea. But then there's the whole issue of someone trying to cheat the system. Gotta prevent that too.
Right, because I imagine with all these complex systems, there's always someone trying to find a loophole.
Exactly. And that's where anti-gaming mechanisms come in. And once again, technology is a big part of the solution. The checklist actually suggests using, get this, blockchain
Well,
technology.
blockchain, like the stuff they use for Bitcoin.
You got it. They actually talk about using blockchain to keep track of, let's say, the origin of trees planted in a reforestation NMA. Makes it way harder to cheat because every single step is recorded on this like permanent and transparent ledger.
That's actually a really cool way to use blockchain. So we're talking about using cutting-edge tech to keep things transparent and accountable in these big NMA projects.
Yeah, it's like adding an extra layer of trust to the whole thing. And it just shows you how this whole world of NMAs, it's constantly changing. New tech, new approaches, they're popping up all the time.
It definitely feels like a space to watch. And it seems like Carbon Updates is right there on the cutting edge, pushing things forward. What kind of tools and services do they actually offer?
So one of the big things they focus on is geospatial analysis and making it, easier and more sophisticated. They have this AI platform that can analyze huge amounts of satellite imagery, find those deforestation hotspots, can even predict where deforestation might happen in the future. Really helpful when you're designing NMAs, especially ones targeting those high-risk areas.
So it's like having a crystal ball that shows you where the deforestation is going to happen next.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just about deforestation. They've got tools for biodiversity assessments, for carbon accounting, even for resolving conflicts. They're building this whole suite of tools to support NMAs from, like, start to finish.
That's amazing. It sounds like they're trying to give people the power to navigate this whole complex world of NMAs and set these projects up for success. But let's be real for a second. All this talk about geospatial analysis, AI, blockchain, it sounds expensive. Who can actually afford to use all this?
That's a fair point. It's something Carbon Updates is very aware of. They have a bunch of different services to fit different budgets. They even have a free trial of their platform, so organizations can try it out, see if it works for them.
That's awesome. Makes these tools a lot more accessible. And speaking of access, let's talk money for a second. The financial side of NMAs, I mean, we've talked about all these complex parts of putting an NMA together, but at the end of the day, you need funding to get it off the ground. How does that work? Where does the money come from?
That's a million-dollar question, right? And it's something we're going to dive into in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. But I'll just say, financing NMAs, it's a whole other landscape to navigate. Often involves mixing public funding, private investment, sometimes philanthropic contributions, and even some new and innovative stuff like green bonds or even crowdfunding.
So it's not just about going to one place and getting a grant.
Nope, it's a lot more creative than that. NMAs, they often fall outside those traditional climate finance boxes. You got to think outside the box to find the right funding.
Okay, well, that definitely sets the stage for a fascinating conversation. I'm definitely looking forward to digging into the money side of things in our next installment. But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, let's just recap for a second. We talked about how hard it is to line up these NMAs with all those UNFCCC frameworks, the importance of doing your homework before you even start, and of course, making sure everyone has a voice, all those stakeholders. Plus, how tech can make all this a little easier. It's clear these NMAs, they're more than just a buzzword. They're a whole new way of thinking about how we tackle climate change. And it's all about collaboration, innovation, and really understanding what's happening on the ground.
I think you summed it up perfectly. NMAs, they're not a quick fix, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You need to plan carefully, be ready to adapt, and be willing to learn as you go. But if we get this right, NMAs have the potential to unlock incredible opportunities for climate action, for sustainable development, for a future that's, well, just more fair for everyone.
And that is definitely a future worth fighting for. But we'll leave you with that thought-provoking statement for now. Come back for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll untangle the mysteries of how to pay for all of this. So we're back, and I'm still thinking about how incredibly complex these NMAs are. It's like wanting to take action on climate change is one thing, but then you realize how much has to fall into place to actually make these projects work.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. NMAs, they really touch on, well, almost every part of a country's development. I mean, you've got their environmental policies, their economic plans, even the social fabric of the country. It goes way beyond just emissions cuts. It's about making things sustainable and fair, solutions that actually make everyone's lives better.
That's what I find so interesting, right? It's not just about trading carbon credits back and forth. It's about finding those solutions that work for everybody, where everyone wins. Do you have any specific examples of NMAs that are doing really cool things, projects that are showing what's possible?
Oh, absolutely. There's this case study I read about. It's mentioned in the Carbon Updates checklist, and it's really fascinating. It's this partnership, and it involves indigenous communities, some national governments, and even private investors. They're all working together to protect a massive chunk of the Amazon rainforest, trying to stop deforestation.
Wow, that sounds incredibly ambitious. What makes this NMA so different, so unique?
Well, it's really their approach. They're not just looking at trees, you know? They're taking this whole system view, looking at the whole ecosystem, the services it provides, all the different species that live there. And they're thinking about the people, the ones whose livelihoods depend on the rainforest. They're trying to create a system that's sustainable and benefits everyone involved.
That's incredible. But I can only imagine how difficult it must be to coordinate something that big. And you're talking about all these different groups, probably with competing interests. How are they managing to pull it off?
Well, that's where all that pre-feasibility work we talked about before comes in, right? They did their homework, analyzed the political landscape, figured out who those potential blockers might be, those veto players, and then they came up with a strategy for engaging with all the stakeholders, addressing their concerns, building that trust.
It's a good reminder that it's not enough just to have a good idea.
Yeah.
You need a solid plan
Mm.
to actually make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. And this NMA is a perfect example of that. They've also gotten really creative with how they monitor and verify everything. Their MRV system,
Oh yeah, what are they doing?
it's a really cool mix. They're using satellite imagery, they're doing drone surveys, and then they've got these indigenous forest guardians who are doing on-the-ground verification. So it's blending traditional knowledge with cutting-edge tech.
I love that. It's like they're taking all these different ways of knowing and weaving them together to get a really complete picture of what's happening in the forest.
That's a great way to put it. And it shows you how powerful it can be when you combine different perspectives, different kinds of expertise. It's not about one being better than the other. It's about finding the right combination for the situation.
Totally. Are there any other examples that come to mind? Other cool projects?
Yeah, there's another one that's pretty groundbreaking. This NMA is focused on getting renewable energy technology adopted faster, and they're doing it in a group of developing countries that have been struggling with energy poverty.
That's such a major issue. So many things depend on access to energy. I mean, education, healthcare. A country's whole economy can be held back without it. What's the NMA approach in this case? How are they tackling it?
It's this pretty complex web of partnerships, honestly. You've got these technology transfer agreements between developed and developing countries. Then there are training programs to build capacity for local technicians. And they've come up with some really innovative financing mechanisms to make investing in renewable energy less risky.
I bet that's tough to coordinate. I mean, you've got multiple countries involved. They probably all have their own laws and regulations. How did they even start to get everyone on the same page?
That was one of the biggest challenges they faced. The checklist mentions all the legal analysis and negotiation that had to happen. They basically had to create this seamless cross-border electricity market, align all the different rules from all these different countries.
Oh, man. I can only imagine the headaches.
Hmm.
But I'm guessing the payoff was huge if they managed to pull it off.
It was. By working together, pooling their resources, and sharing their expertise, they were able to transition to clean energy much faster than any one of them could have done alone. It really proves that collaboration is key when you're trying to drive real climate action.
It's honestly so inspiring to hear about these innovative ways to solve problems. But, let's be realistic for a second. Not every NMA is going to be a perfect success story. What are some of the, I don't know, the common traps that can derail these projects, the things that
Mhm.
can make them go wrong?
You're right, it's never easy, and there are always bumps in the road,
Um,
unexpected challenges. One of the most frequent and one that can really cause things to fall apart is not engaging with stakeholders enough. If you don't get the communities who'll be affected by the NMA on board, if they don't support the project, it's almost guaranteed to fail.
do you have an example, something specific that comes to mind?
Actually, yeah, the carbon updates checklist talks about this case. But they ran into huge conflict with the local communities because, those communities depended on those peatlands for their livelihoods.
Oh, man, that's rough. It
Hmm.
seems like a classic case of, like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
It really is, and it shows how vital it is to not just talk to stakeholders, but actually listen to them, understand their needs, and make sure everyone benefits, that everyone is winning.
Right, because even with the best intentions, you can still run into conflict. Are there, like, any tools or strategies that can help people navigate those situations?
Oh, for sure. Carbon updates, they're really big on conflict resolution mechanisms. They actually have a whole team of experts who can come in and mediate, facilitate conversations, find creative solutions that address the real root causes of the conflict.
That's got to be so helpful. Because even if you plan everything perfectly, there are always going to be surprises. It's reassuring to know there's help out there, people who can guide you through those tough spots.
Exactly. And that's all part of how we're learning to implement NMAs. It's constantly evolving, right? New tools, new strategies are popping up all the time. We're getting better at making these projects effective and fair.
It's pretty cool to be a part of it,
Yeah.
to see how this is shaping the future of climate action. But I don't want us to forget about a really key piece, the money. We've talked about all these amazing projects, these innovative approaches, but how do we actually pay for them? Where's the funding coming from?
That's the golden question, and it's one we're going to dig into in our next segment. Financing NMAs is a whole landscape of its own, and it's constantly changing, too. But there are some really exciting new trends emerging, and I can't wait to tell you about them.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention. I'm looking forward to that conversation. But for now, let's leave our listeners with this. NMAs, they're not some magical solution to climate change, but they do offer a really powerful way to create a better future. One that's sustainable, one that's fair. It's a journey, that's for sure. It requires collaboration, creativity, and a willingness to embrace all the complexity. But ultimately, I think it's a journey worth taking.
Well said. I agree completely. We'll see you all back here soon for the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, and it's time to tackle the big question. Money. We've talked about all the amazing things NMAs can do, all the moving parts, but how do you actually fund these ambitious projects?
It's a question everyone wants to know the answer to, and rightfully so. The thing is, NMAs, they don't always fit neatly into the traditional ways we think about climate finance. So finding the funding, it can feel like solving a puzzle sometimes.
So it's not as straightforward as just, say, applying for a grant from one of those big international funds.
It can be a lot trickier than that. See, a lot of the funding mechanisms out there, they're designed for projects where, you can easily measure how much emissions you're cutting, quantify it and verify it. But NMAs, they often have a broader focus. They're about sustainable development and the impacts. They can be harder to measure sometimes.
So then, Where does the money actually come from? Are governments just footing the bill for all this?
Well, governments are definitely part of the equation, but it's not all on them. The real magic happens when you start looking at, more diverse ways to get funding, thinking outside the box.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Like what kind of creative approaches are we talking about?
Think about mixing public funding with private investments, maybe some philanthropic contributions too. And then you've got those really innovative mechanisms like green bonds or even crowdfunding. It's about building this tapestry of different funding sources, something that can support all the different stages of an NMA, from developing the idea to actually implementing it.
Right, so it's not just one pot of money. But that sounds incredibly complex to manage. I mean, all those different funding sources, they probably come with different rules, different restrictions. How do you even keep track of it all?
It's definitely a challenge, no doubt. And that's where, organizations like Carbon Updates can really make a difference. They live and breathe this stuff. They understand the climate finance landscape, and they can help you navigate all the complexities of co-financing optimization.
Co-financing optimization. Okay, that sounds like something you need a PhD to understand. Break it down for me.
Sure, it's basically about strategically using those different funding sources, layering them in a way that gives you the biggest impact, but, without breaking any rules. It's like a balancing act, making sure that one funding stream doesn't mess up another one because the terms clash.
So it's not just about getting the money, it's about getting the right money from the right places at the right time.
Exactly. And that's where expert guidance is so valuable. Carbon updates, they can help you figure out who might be willing to fund your project, help you structure the deals, even model different financial scenarios, so you know your NMA will be sustainable in the long run.
It sounds like they're taking a lot of the guesswork out of the process, which has got to be a relief for organizations that are already trying to handle all the other challenges of setting up an NMA.
Oh, for sure. It lets them focus on what they're good at, which is designing impactful projects, the ones that actually make a difference on the ground.
But let's be real, even with the best financial plans, there's always going to be some risk, right? What if, I don't know, a country becomes politically unstable, or the economy tanks? Or what about those increasingly crazy weather events? Couldn't any of those things throw a wrench in the works?
You're absolutely right. No investment is completely risk-free, and NMAs are no exception. That's why it's so important to think about de-risking mechanisms. Build those safeguards right into your financial strategy.
De-risking mechanisms, what are we talking about here?
Think of them like insurance policies. They help protect the investors, and they make sure the NMA can keep going, even if something unexpected happens. Things like first loss guarantees, those can provide a safety net if the project starts losing money. Or parametric insurance that can pay out if certain triggers happen, like, I don't know, extreme rainfall or a drought.
So it's like, yeah, buying an insurance policy for your NMA just in case things go south.
It's a good way to think about it. And those kinds of mechanisms, they can make NMAs a lot more attractive to investors, especially the ones who are, a bit cautious about putting their money into something that seems risky.
That makes sense. I mean, everyone wants to know their money is safe, right? Especially when we're talking about projects that are tackling these big, complex, global challenges.
Yeah.
But honestly, all this talk about financial engineering, de-rifting mechanisms, it's a lot to take in. Do you need to be like a Wall Street whiz to understand all this?
Not at all. There are tons of resources out there to help make sense of it all. Carbon updates, for example, they've got these tools, and they're designed to be user-friendly. They can help you come up with a solid financial strategy, figure out which de-risking mechanisms make sense for your project, even connect you with potential investors.
That's great. It's good to know that this kind of support exists and that it's not just, the big players who can access it.
Exactly. That's the whole point of NMAs, right? They're about empowering everyone, communities, governments, businesses, no matter how big or small, to work together and build a sustainable future. And that means making the financial side of things transparent and easy to understand.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the high-level concepts of Article 6.8 all the way down to the nitty-gritty of stakeholder engagement, MRV systems, and now all the financial ins and outs. It's been quite a journey exploring this world of NMAs.
It really has. And what I hope people take away from this is that NMAs, they're not just some abstract idea. They're a real, practical way to tackle climate change, a way to create a future that's better for everyone.
And even though they're complex and they require careful planning and implementation, the benefits can be huge. We've seen examples of NMAs protecting rainforests, driving the shift to clean energy, giving communities the power to shape their own future.
It's truly inspiring to see what people can achieve when they collaborate, when they share a vision, when they're committed to finding solutions that work for everyone. And I think NMAs are going to become even more important in the fight against climate change.
I couldn't agree more. It's been a pleasure having you here to break it all down, and I hope our listeners are feeling energized and inspired to learn more about NMAs and maybe even find ways to get involved. So thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the world of non-market approaches. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit hopeful. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.